The wind howled through the jagged peaks of the northern mountains, carrying with it a bitter cold that seemed to pierce every layer of clothing. Snowflakes fell relentlessly, covering the rugged landscape in a thick, white blanket, erasing familiar paths and landmarks. Somewhere within this frozen expanse, a lone figure struggled forward, her movements slow and labored. She was an old woman, frail and shivering, her breath forming small clouds that vanished instantly into the wind. Her hands were raw and red from the cold, her feet numb, and her back bent from years of hardship. With each step, the snow threatened to swallow her. And yet, she pressed on, driven by a fragile hope that she might find shelter before the storm claimed her entirely. Her name was Margaret, though she had long ceased expecting kindness from anyone who heard it. For weeks, she had wandered from village to village, her fragile body carrying the weight of neglect and mistreatment. Relatives had abandoned her, inns had turned her away, and townsfolk had recoiled at her appearance and her frailty. Every door that shut in her face reinforced the harsh truth she had always feared. In this world, no one truly cared for someone like her. She had grown accustomed to loneliness, yet something deep within her whispered that tonight could be different. Through the white haze, she spotted a faint light flickering in the distance atop a small ridge. At first, she thought it a trick of the storm, a mirage conjured by her desperation. But as she drew closer, the light solidified into a warm glow emanating from a cabin, a small structure built sturdily from logs and stone, smoke curling from a chimney high into the sky. Her legs, weakened by cold and hunger, trembled as she approached. Each step felt heavier than the last, her boots leaving deep impressions in the snow. When she finally reached the cabin door, she collapsed briefly, her chest heaving, her fingers numb and stiff. Summoning what little strength remained, she raised a shaking hand and knocked. "Sir, I'm sick. I can't walk far. Can I stay? Just one night?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. The words trembled out of her mouth, carrying not just a plea, but the weight of years of pain, abandonment, and unspoken fear. Inside the cabin, a shadow stirred. Elias Boone, a man known in the nearby town as a recluse, observed the figure through the frosted window. His life had been spent in solitude, far from the judgment and gossip of the village. To most, he was intimidating, a man of few words, with hands calloused by decades of labor and eyes that seemed to peer through lies and pretense alike. But as he saw her struggle, something in him stirred, a quiet, almost forgotten sense of empathy. Without a word, he crossed the room, opened the door, and regarded her. He did not ask for her story, nor did he question why she was out in such weather. He merely stepped aside, silently allowing her to enter. The warmth of the cabin immediately embraced her, a stark contrast to the biting wind outside. For the first time in weeks, Margaret felt safe. She stumbled forward, guided by the dim glow of a lantern, and found herself in a small, cozy room with a fire crackling in the hearth. Elias led her to a chair and offered her a thick blanket dot as she wrapped herself in its comforting folds. She realized that this night might mark the first glimmer of hope in a long, bleak winter of her life. Though she could not yet know the depth of the mountain man's kindness or the impact he would have on her future, the first barrier had been crossed. Someone had opened their door to her when everyone else had turned away. For Margaret, that simple act of compassion, the willingness to let a stranger in, to acknowledge her existence, was nothing short of a miracle. Outside, the storm raged on, relentless and unforgiving. Inside, a fragile trust began to form, and for the first time in a long while, the old woman allowed herself to hope. Elias Boone watched quietly as the old woman settled herself in the chair, her frail shoulders hunched and trembling, hands wrapped tightly around the blanket he had offered. His cabin, modest and sturdy, smelled faintly of pine smoke and dried herbs. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting shadows that danced across the walls, illuminating the tools, hunting gear, and simple furniture that marked a life lived in solitude. Elias rarely had visitors. In fact, for years, the only sounds he had heard were the wind outside, the creak of timber, and the occasional call of a distant hawk. Now, a stranger weak, sick, and vulnerable sat in his home, and he studied her carefully. He did not speak. Words had never been his preferred method of communication. His hands, rough and scarred, moved methodically toward a small cabinet where he kept dried herbs and medicinal roots he gathered in the forest. He crushed a few leaves and boiled them in water, the pungent aroma rising into the cabin. He set the steaming cup on the table before her. Margaret stared at it uncertainly, a mixture of fear and hope in her eyes. "Drink," he said quietly, his voice deep and steady, carrying no judgment, no questions, just a simple command layered with concern. Hesitantly, she sipped. The warmth seeped into her body, chasing the chill from her bones. Elias's gaze softened, though he did not remove his rugged exterior. For the mountain man, action spoke louder than words. He moved about the cabin, bringing her extra blankets, arranging a small pile of firewood closer to the hearth, and checking the temperature of the room to ensure she would remain warm. Each gesture, simple yet deliberate, conveyed a care that Margaret had not experienced in decades. She had been turned away countless times, dismissed by neighbors, and abandoned by those who should have protected her. Here, she was not only welcomed but tended to, and the realization left her nearly breathless. As the night deepened, her cough worsened and a fever burned through her thin body. Elias did not flinch. He gently pressed a wet cloth to her forehead, keeping vigil as the firelight flickered across his stern face. No one had ever stayed with her through such moments of vulnerability. The thought of being alone in the dark, dying unnoticed, had haunted her for years. Yet here was a man who refused to leave her side, who moved silently yet purposefully to make her as comfortable as possible. His choice was simple in action but monumental in impact. He had chosen compassion over convenience, humanity over indifference. Margaret's fear began to ebb as the hours passed. Her eyes, once clouded with worry and despair, now reflected cautious gratitude. She attempted to speak, her voice fragile. "Why? Why are you helping me? You barely know me." Elias did not answer immediately. Instead, he placed another blanket over her shoulders and nodded toward the cup of herbal tea. He finally said, softly but firmly, because someone should. No further explanation was needed. There was no judgment of her past, no curiosity about her misfortunes. Only a quiet acceptance of her existence and suffering. The storm outside raged with unabating fury, snow beating against the cabin walls. Yet inside, a fragile warmth enveloped them. For Margaret, it was a revelation. Not all humans were cruel. Some, like Elias Boone, understood that kindness was an action, not a word, and that sometimes the simplest choices, offering shelter, tending a fever, lending a listening ear, could save a life. By the time dawn approached, the first hints of light creeping over the snow-covered peaks, Margaret felt a flicker of hope she had long thought extinguished. The mountain man, silent and steady, had done more than provide temporary refuge. He had given her the first real comfort of safety she had known in years. And in that moment, Margaret began to understand that his choice to let her in might not only change her night but could very well change the course of her life. The night stretched on, long and quiet, punctuated only by the occasional crackle of the fire and the howl of the storm outside. Margaret lay in the bed Elias had prepared for her, bundled under thick blankets, her body trembling from fever and exhaustion. For the first time in weeks, she did not feel the biting chill of the mountain wind, nor the crushing loneliness that had followed her from town to town. The warmth of the cabin and the steady presence of Elias Boone provided a fragile cocoon of safety she had not dared to imagine as the night deepened. Margaret's thoughts drifted back to her journey to the trail that had led her here. She remembered the closed doors of neighbors, the cold glances of villagers, the whispered judgments that had labeled her a burden. She thought of her distant relatives, people who had taken her in only to cast her out once her health failed. Her voice, when it came, was hoarse and weak. I never thought anyone would care enough to help me," she murmured, almost to herself. Elias, who had been quietly tending the fire, paused and looked toward her. He did not speak immediately, nor did he approach her bed. His eyes, sharp and observant, softened as he listened. There was no need for words right away. Her trembling, her strained breathing, the subtle tremor in her hands, all of it told him the story of her suffering. He had spent his life observing human nature, and he understood that some truths did not need to be spoken, they were lived. Endured and painfully obvious, Margaret continued, her voice growing slightly stronger as she recounted the hardships she had endured. She told him about her relatives' cruelty, their impatience with her frailty, and the final blow of being left to wander the freezing mountains alone. Tears welled in her eyes as she spoke, but she also felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time, someone was listening without judgment, without interruption. Elias's silence was not indifference. It was attention. It was understanding. It was a form of respect. As she spoke, Elias felt a resonance deep within himself. He had lost his mother years ago, a woman of warmth and strength who had fallen ill while he was away. No one had offered her shelter, no one had stayed with her, and she had passed alone. The memory had haunted him, a shadow he carried even in his solitude. Seeing Margaret, frail and defenseless, brought that memory sharply into focus. He recognized her suffering as a reflection of a pain he had long vowed never to ignore again. Without a word, he moved closer, placing a wet cloth gently on her forehead to ease the fever, adjusting her blankets and ensuring the fire burned steadily. He brewed another cup of herbal tea, the aroma filling the room, and handed it to her with a steady, reassuring hand. In his quiet, methodical way, he communicated a profound truth. She was not alone. Not tonight, not in this cabin, not while he was there. Margaret, sensing the depth of his care, felt a fragile trust begin to bloom. She had braced herself for indifference, perhaps even harsh words, but instead found compassion. The mountain man had not asked why she was alone, nor had he judged her past. He had simply chosen to act, to protect, to care, to be present. And in that choice, Margaret discovered a seed of hope. Outside, the storm raged, relentless and unforgiving. Yet inside the cabin, a quiet miracle unfolded. In the shared silence, broken only by the soft sounds of the fire and her coughing, Margaret began to understand that this night, this single act of kindness, could change the course of her life. And Elias, steadfast and silent, had become the guardian of that change. The unlikely hero who had taken it upon himself to right a small corner of the world that had been cruel and cold for far too long. By the time sleep finally claimed her, Margaret felt a fragile warmth in her heart. For the first time in years, she dared to believe that not all humans were indifferent, and that perhaps, just perhaps, one man could restore her faith in the goodness of others. Morning arrived with a muted glow, sunlight filtering weakly through the heavy gray clouds that still hung low over the mountains. The storm had begun to ease, but the snow still lay deep, masking familiar paths and making travel treacherous. Inside the cabin, Margaret stirred beneath the warm blankets, her body feeling heavy but less burdened than the night before. She had survived the cold, the storm, and the harsh journey. But her greatest trial, the fear of being utterly alone, had been met with something far beyond her expectations. Elias Boone, the reclusive mountain man, had watched over her all night. Now it was time for him to act. He moved quietly around the cabin, preparing for the journey ahead. Though Margaret's strength had returned slightly, she was still too weak to make the journey down the mountain on her own. Elias grabbed a small sled he had constructed for hauling firewood and wrapped her carefully in thick blankets, ensuring she was secure. His movements were efficient, purposeful, and protective, leaving nothing to chance. The sight of the tall, rugged man, stoic yet tender, lifting and securing her with such care was a stark contrast to the cold indifference she had faced from townsfolk. The trek down the mountain was slow and grueling. Snow clung to Elias's boots, and the sled sank into drifts at every step. Margaret, shivering slightly despite the blankets, could only watch him, marveling at the strength and determination that belied his quiet demeanor. He did not complain, nor did he pause unnecessarily. His focus was entirely on ensuring her safety. The physical exertion was immense, yet he moved with the calm precision of a man accustomed to survival in harsh conditions. As they approached the town, word of their arrival began to spread. Townspeople had seen snow-covered figures emerging from the mountains before, but none had anticipated the sight of Elias Boone, typically solitary and intimidating, bringing an elderly, sick woman into town. Eyes widened, whispers rose, and people hurried to windows and doorways, unsure what they were witnessing. The combination of shock and curiosity created a palpable tension. Margaret, feeling both fear and hope, realized the town would soon confront the contrast between their own neglect and the mountain man's compassion. Elias did not wait for introductions or explanations. He brought Margaret directly to the town doctor, explaining her condition briefly and firmly. "She needs care. No excuses," he said, his voice calm yet commanding. The doctor, taken aback by the sudden intrusion and by Elias's authoritative presence, hurried to attend to her. While the doctor worked, Elias handed over a heavy pouch of coins, covering whatever expenses might be incurred. There was no debate, no pleading, only a decisive act of responsibility. The townspeople watched silently, some ashamed, others incredulous. They realized, perhaps too late, that they had all turned their backs on her when she needed help most. Whispers of guilt and judgment rippled through the crowd. A few tried to rationalize their neglect, citing fear, distance, or the winter storm, but the undeniable truth remained. One man had acted where all others had failed. Elias, stoic and unwavering, had shown them what true courage and humanity looked like. Margaret, exhausted but safe, felt a wave of gratitude she could not put into words. The mountain man had done more than provide shelter. He had carried her through danger, through fear, and into the care she so desperately needed. His actions were a testament not only to his character, but to the power of simple, decisive kindness. For the first time, Margaret understood that help could come from the most unexpected places, and that one act of compassion could ripple far beyond the individual it touched. By the time she was settled in a warm room under the doctor's care, the townspeople had begun to murmur among themselves, the weight of shame pressing on them. The day had begun with a storm, but thanks to Elias Boone, a storm of another kind, a storm of indifference and neglect, had been exposed and challenged. And Margaret, once weak, cold, and almost defeated, now held a spark of hope that might never have been possible without the mountain man's decisive actions. The days following Margaret's arrival in town were filled with an uneasy tension. The townspeople, once absorbed in their daily routines and small grievances, could not ignore the ripple effect of what had happened. Word had spread quickly. Elias Boone, the solitary mountain man whom most had avoided or whispered about with suspicion, had carried a frail, sick woman through snow and ice to safety. He had ensured she received medical attention, provided for her needs, and treated her with a level of care that contrasted sharply with the indifference and judgment of the community. The shame among the townspeople was palpable. In the main square, people whispered behind closed shutters and behind one another's backs. Some tried to excuse themselves, claiming the storm had been too severe or that Margaret was a stranger whose problems were not theirs to bear. Others, however, felt an undeniable sting of guilt, realizing that fear, prejudice, and self-interest had kept them from acting when she needed help most. They had mocked her frailty, turned away from her pleas, and now were confronted with the stark truth. One man had done what all of them had refused to do. Elias Boone's actions held up a mirror, reflecting their own failures in a way that was impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, Elias remained largely silent. He did not seek acknowledgment, did not relish the discomfort he caused the townspeople, nor did he explain or justify his actions. His focus remained on Margaret. Each day he visited her, bringing warm soup, firewood, and fresh blankets from his cabin in the mountains. The doctor had made it clear that she would need time to regain her strength, and Elias's quiet, steady support proved invaluable. Margaret began to heal, both physically and emotionally. She felt a security she had long thought impossible, a sense that someone truly cared for her well-being without asking for anything in return. The contrast between Elias's actions and the town's earlier neglect did not go unnoticed. Children, curious and wide-eyed, began asking their parents why no one had helped the old woman sooner. Elders, confronted with their own failures, felt shame prick at their conscience. Conversations in homes, shops, and the tavern gradually shifted from gossip and trivial complaints to discussions about empathy, responsibility, and moral courage. For many, it was a humbling and uncomfortable reckoning. Margaret, observing the town's response and the quiet dignity of Elias's care, began to feel a renewed sense of purpose. She realized that her survival, her recovery, and even her opportunity for a small measure of comfort depended not just on Elias's strength, but on the lesson his actions had forced upon the town. The community, whether reluctantly or sincerely, began to contribute. Neighbors brought food, blankets, and small comforts, attempting to make amends for their earlier neglect. Some offered apologies, awkward but heartfelt, while others simply acted with newfound attentiveness, hoping to demonstrate kindness through deeds rather than words. Through it all, Elias remained a steadfast presence, neither seeking credit nor forgiveness from the townspeople. His actions had set the standard. The town was now forced to meet it, and in doing so, they began to reclaim some measure of humanity they had allowed to wither. Margaret, recovering steadily, felt her own heart lighten. She understood that she had become a catalyst not by choice, but by circumstance for a transformation in the town's conscience. By the end of the week, the once indifferent town had begun to awaken to the realization that true courage and compassion often require action rather than words, and that sometimes a single act of kindness can shame a whole community into reflection. Margaret, once weak, cold, and abandoned, now found herself surrounded by care, her gratitude tempered with the quiet understanding that the mountain man's actions had not only saved her life, they had changed the moral course of the town itself. By the time Margaret had fully regained her strength, the town had transformed in subtle yet profound ways. Where there had once been indifference and whispered judgment, there was now attentiveness and quiet respect. People had witnessed the unwavering care Elias Boone had provided, and his actions had sparked something they could not ignore. The realization that kindness and courage often required more than words. They demanded deliberate, sometimes inconvenient, action. The lesson lingered like an unspoken truth in every home, shop, and street corner, leaving an imprint on the town's conscience that would not fade quickly. Margaret, once frail, cold, and nearly defeated, now walked with confidence and renewed purpose. Her body had healed, but more importantly, her spirit had been restored. The fear and hopelessness that had haunted her for so long had been replaced with a sense of security and belonging. She understood that her survival was not just a matter of chance or circumstance. It was the result of one man's steadfast commitment to doing what was right. Elias Boone had not only saved her from the storm and illness, but had also shown her that compassion could exist even in a world that often seemed cruel. For his part, Elias remained as quiet and reserved as ever, though a subtle change could be seen in his demeanor. He no longer appeared solely as the solitary stoic figure of legend. The townspeople, once wary or suspicious of him, had begun to regard him with newfound respect. Some approached him cautiously, offering thanks or small gifts. Others simply observed from a distance, quietly acknowledging that the man they had long feared had demonstrated a depth of humanity that few possessed. Elias did not seek acknowledgement. He never had, but the impact of his actions was undeniable. Margaret chose not to return to her previous home or relatives, knowing that the abuse and neglect she had endured would likely resume if she did. Instead, she moved into a modest cabin near Elias's, close enough that he could continue to check on her and offer support. The two formed a quiet companionship built on mutual respect, trust, and shared understanding. There was no need for grand declarations or formal introductions. Their bond was forged in the simplicity of care, in the trust of being there for one another when the world had turned its back. The townspeople, witnessing Margaret's recovery and the quiet partnership between her and Elias, began to take note of the broader lesson. They saw that compassion was contagious, that one act of kindness could ripple outward, touching lives far beyond the initial moment. Some townsfolk became more attentive to the needs of the vulnerable, helping neighbors in small but meaningful ways. Others reflected on their past behavior, recognizing the harm of neglect and prejudice. The storm that had first brought Margaret to Elias's door had not only tested the limits of human endurance but had also exposed the latent potential for empathy and moral courage within the town itself. In time, Margaret and Elias became quietly revered figures, not for fame or recognition, but for the profound example they set. Their story was told not as a tale of drama or heroics, but as a lesson in integrity, selflessness, and the power of action. Those who had once ignored the suffering of others began to understand that true character is measured not by words or appearances, but by deeds in moments of need. For Margaret, life regained its color and warmth. For Elias, the isolation that had once defined him softened, replaced with a sense of purpose and quiet fulfillment. And for the town, the storm had been both literal and metaphorical, leaving behind a community transformed by the courage of a solitary man and the resilience of an old woman who refused to give up. Together, they embodied a simple truth: even in a harsh world, compassion can prevail, and a single act of kindness can ripple outward to change lives, sometimes even an entire town. And so, in the shadow of the mountains and the memory of the storm, a new chapter began, defined by trust, care, and the quiet, enduring power of human goodness.